Welcome to our National Conversation, a podcast in which we discuss politics from all angles. We are completely nonpartisan, and all views, respectfully stated, are welcome here. Our podcast is unique in that it is hosted and run by students who are focused on finding solutions to the biggest problems facing America.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Michaela Eidelberg, and I'm your host for today's episode of Allow Us to Explain. Today, we're going to be talking about immigration, specifically our immigration policy in the United States. Joining me here today is Callie Concert and Ruben Navarrette. If you guys would like to introduce yourselves, please feel free to do so.
My name is Kaylee Concert. Not Callie. I'm a third-year poli-sci student at UCLA, studying professional writing as well. So I'm on the core content team for our national conversation. And I take the moderate position, but obviously that entails that I have a lot of different opinions from both sides. So I'm really excited to discuss a lot of different opinions today.
I'm Ruben Navarrette. I'm a syndicated columnist with the Washington Post Writers Group. I'm a mentor to our national conversation.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for joining me here today. And just a little bit about myself, I am a journalism intern here at our national conversation, and I'm a junior at the University of Southern California. So without further ado, let's get started. So security in the United States is a major factor of why immigration is a big issue considering the facts. And according to this Pew study, it says by the Pew Research Center that as of August of 2023, of the 7,647 U.S. adults surveyed, 73% of them said increasing security along the U.S. Mexico border has been due to illegal crossings and should be, and closing that gap should be an important goal. So, for example, there's a large increase in the number of Democrats who believe that security at the U.S.-Mexico border should be used to reduce illegal crossings, and that should be an important goal. So how should the U.S.-Mexico border situation be handled? Ruben, and then Kaylee, whenever you get a chance.
So just by my background, I've been writing and speaking about immigration for 30 years, right, left, and center. It's a very difficult issue to make your way through. But in terms of security, border security is interesting because it polls, as you said, at 70%. People would much rather have a secure border than an insecure border. It's also something that both political parties come to and support. It's low-hanging fruit. Democrats and Republicans have both voted for things in the past, like the 2006 Secure Fence Act, which passed through Congress and was signed into law, and basically by President Bush, that basically fortified the border. Before that, Operation Gatekeeper under the Bill Clinton administration, which fortified the border and provided more security south of San Diego and other spots around the country. So both political parties agree with it. One of the reasons we talk security a lot is because, in an issue like immigration, where there's a lot of disagreement, people will tend to gravitate to the things that we agree on. It's rare to find 70% of Americans agreeing on anything these days. But having said that, look, if you take the long view of immigration and the immigration debate dating back to the first immigrants, who were German immigrants coming to Pennsylvania in the late 1700s and being greeted by rank bigotry by people like Benjamin Franklin and others who thought the Germans were wrecking our culture. To be fair, the immigration debate is only partially about security. It's about 50%. 50% of it is about racism, nativism, bigotry, the same old stuff we've dealt with every immigrant group, the Irish, the Italians, everyone gets it. And then the other 50% is divided up into different slices. And one of those slices is border security. So I think the very first step to finding an immigration solution, if you want to call it that, that would imply that we have a problem. I'm not sure that Americans are of consensus that we have a problem. Not to the point where we go out and fire our nanny in protest, or fire our gardener in protest, or fire our housekeeper in protest. But the degree to which you can find a problem, it starts with one thing. You have to be honest. You have to do something politicians are not known for doing, and particularly with immigration. You have to be honest about how we got here, and honest about the fact that the immigration debate is about so much more than just security.
Thank you so much, Ruben. Kaylee, what are your thoughts?
I completely agree. I was going to say something similar when it comes to the broad question of how security should be handled as a whole. Like you said, it's more than that. I can't give as thoughtful of a response as Ruben did, but I think the reason security is an issue is because people feel insecure throughout this country for whatever reason that is. And if we're going to go about solving that insecurity, we have to find the root of it. And like you said, there's a ton of reasons, like racism and such. And if we can figure out how to make people feel less insecure, then maybe they can reevaluate the need for security instead of going right to the problem itself, the problem, if that makes sense.
No, it definitely makes sense. Thank you so much for your answer and your opinion. We really appreciate that. And just to move forward, we'd like to talk about security. There's talk about the Biden administration continuing the construction of like the physical border wall. And research shows that around 26 of federally recognized Native American nations, as well as 8 indigenous peoples in Mexico, live around that U.S.-Mexico border and will be kind of affected by that wall. So how do you think the physical construction of this wall would explicitly and implicitly affect these communities? Ruben first, and then Katie, whenever you're ready.
Well, you put your finger on one of the reasons that we don't have an effective border wall policy from, as it's advertised by politicians, from San Diego, California to Brownsville, Texas. That entire border wall, that border with Mexico is almost 2,000 miles long. And various points along that border, you have things like waterways, you have rivers, you can't build a wall on a river. You have Indian reservations, you have private land. You have rocky terrain that doesn't allow itself for crossings anyway, and wouldn't make sense to put a border there, or put a wall there. You have areas of the border where it's so remote that, say, in wintertime, it would be dangerous to cross there because it would take them days to get back to, civilization, so to speak, and so they avoid that spot. So it's, again, very convenient for politicians to say, I'm going to build a big, beautiful wall, to borrow a phrase from former President Donald Trump, and it's going to go from the coastline of California all the way to the end of Texas. And that's going to be possible. It's not possible. Typically, of those 2,000 miles, only about 700 miles are available for kind of wall and fencing. And we have a lot of walls and fences there already in that spot, put there by Democrats and Republicans alike. To your question about how it's going to affect those communities, I don't even think we ever get that far. We've never gotten that far. We've never had a conversation about how it's going to impact Indian reservations, for instance, or Native American communities, because it's so impractical. There's already so many lawsuits that would be filed. It's typically not something that we ever get to. And so we have to, again, separate what the politicians are telling us from the reality on the ground. And the Border Patrol agents are really the real experts there. They work it every day. They work the border every day. You should listen to Border Patrol agents as to what's feasible and not feasible, but don't listen to politicians, many of whom either have never visited the border, never been on the other side, never seen it as I have from a Border Patrol helicopter flying over the border, and they don't have a sense for just how impossible it is to section off 2,000 miles of border wall.
Definitely read that because of Native American communities and living in their areas, they have a lot of high rates of poverty and living below the poverty line and such, and which makes them more susceptible to trafficking groups who might coerce them into trafficking drugs or helping them. So I think that one thing is just getting them near the wall, if there was one. Like you said, Ruben, maybe it doesn't get that far, but having them be closer to all that, and they're more susceptible to getting involved in those activities when maybe they might have never been involved before, is definitely a possible effect. And of course, there's the question of the environment and everything, and all the species that are living there, and how Native American lands are a hotspot for environmental diversity and everything. So, I mean, a big, huge structure in the middle of the desert, like you said, it's gonna do some damage.
Important footnote, if I may, important footnote, based on what you just said. There are these federal laws that prohibit building border walls in certain communities, and also it tries to slow down the construction of the border wall so you could study the environmental impact, for instance. And it's those laws that the Biden administration is circumventing with a series of executive orders, over 20 of them, in order to facilitate a building on the border wall. So the headline reads, Biden reverses course on border wall, having promised not to build another foot. Now he's going to build almost 20 miles of it. But beyond the headline, you have a series of other stories, and one of them is that in order to do that and pull that off, he's had to override federal laws that would seek some of that protections that you're asking for. So in other words, we've done the right thing before. We've passed those laws to do the right thing, but we also have elected politicians who will undo those laws and thereby, do the wrong thing.
So considering these obvious restrictions and regulations due to the environment and due to Native American land, why do you think the Trump and now the Biden administration is pushing for this construction if it's virtually impossible, it seems?
Well, you read it earlier, right? The poll statistic that said 70% of Americans support construction of a border wall and greater border security as they define it. I think the distinction that needs to be made ultimately is you can be in favor of increased border security, as I am, as a lot of Americans are, and still not think the answer is a wall. Mm-hmm. So I want a smart border. I wrote recently in a column that we think about your generation. Your generation's grown up with smartphones, smart TVs, smart cars. But two things we don't have a smart border, and we don't have smart politicians. If you had smart politicians, they would give you a smart border. And a smart border uses what Border Patrol wants, which is tunnel detection equipment, more roads along the U.S.-Mexico border so that you can apprehend undocumented immigrants more easily, and also electronic surveillance equipment, right? You can appreciate this. So much of your world in your generation is around technology and computers and iPads and iPhones. And likewise, imagine trying to battle these smugglers who are bringing people across, making hundreds of $millions of dollars a year to do it. And they all have iPhones and iPads, and it's all high tech, right? So I want to give the Border Patrol all the high tech stuff that they need instead of building this wall that can be, gone under, over, or around. So we'd be in a better place on immigration policy if we stopped listening to the politicians and started listening to the Border Patrol agents on the ground.
Thank you so much.
To jump in and answer your question before, why would they continue to do it even though we were heading in the right direction? And since you talked about, Ruben, how the wall is as a thing itself is useless and we need more security and other methods, I think at the end of the day, politicians are pushing for it because it really will just serve as a symbol that will make people feel better. At the end of the day, it is a symbol. It's a huge metal wall. It's instead of, is it actually doing anything? Everyone debates about that. But at the end of the day, I think politicians are pushing for it because people really see it as a symbol that will make them feel better, maybe help them sleep at night. Right.
If I could follow up on that part quickly. So there's an interesting wrinkle that nobody ever talks about or writes about. And I mentioned it a few times, but I should mention it more often. And that is that I'll tell it with a story. So there's a very good border reporter, immigration reporter, a friend of mine named Alfredo Corchado, who I'd recommend to you. He's been an instructor as well, but he's on the job and he works for the Dallas Morning News and he covers the border and he covers both sides of the border. And he was born in Mexico, and he tells a story about being in a bar in Mexico. You're going to love this story. Being in a bar in Mexico, such color, and there's a bunch of people up at the bar buying drinks. They're celebrating. And he asks the bartender, why are they celebrating? What's this occasion? And he goes, those guys, he whispers, the bartender goes, those guys are coyotes. Those guys are smugglers. Those guys run a human trafficking ring that bring people into the U.S. And they're celebrating because Congress just passed a huge border security package that involves all this new funding for walls and security and more border patrolmen. You get the idea of these bills. And Alfredo said, well, why are they celebrating that? And then he pieced it together. When you do that, you allow the cartels to raise their prices. The cartels are working on a market economy like every other business. And they used to charge, say, $500 to get across, then it became $5,000. But every time there's an increase in the border security apparatus, they can raise their prices because they can say, look, to their clients, they say, look, it just got much more dangerous to bring you across. So they're buying drinks because Congress, in its stupidity, its bipartisan stupidity, puts money into the pockets of its adversaries, of the bad guys, of the enemies, of the cartels. Because every time it does, as you say, a symbolic gesture of building a wall, they're just empowering their enemy, their adversary. So it never works. And nobody ever talks about that. It's counterintuitive. But you don't learn that, where I studied at Harvard, you don't learn it at the Columbia School of Journalism. You learn it in a bar in Mexico on the ground.
That's crazy. They were celebrating that. It makes sense.
That's definitely interesting. And we, like in America, definitely don't think about that to that extent that, once everything we do has an effect to this extent, So for sure, thank you so much for sharing that story, Ruben. Just to move on, talking about, just like the economics of it and the money of it, for many undocumented immigrants here that manage to actually cross the border and get into the U.S., they're forced into these situations, especially when it comes to jobs and housing, that they can't get government aid in these situations. So, do you believe that pressure should fall on the individual employers or landlords, or should it fall on the government to lessen that pressure and give them aid and things like that? Kaylee, if you would like to start, and Ruben, follow up whenever you're ready.
Not too informed on this, but I think most Americans would agree that individual landlords and employers should definitely not be responsible for dealing with the burdens of immigration issues, especially when it comes to providing assistance in housing. I think that even the idea of that would anger a lot of people. So definitely think that the government should help lessen the pressure and kind of take on a larger role if they can. I guess in the situation that an individual employer would be responsible, I'm guessing the government is at their limit and is forcing it onto the citizen. But there's no situation I see where it's justifiable where the individual employers, I'm not 100% sure what you mean by individual employers should be reliable for, essentially providing asylum.
So I don't think, I would agree this isn't the role of the employers or even the government, and it's not really necessary because economically these immigrants are doing fine. I won't say that they're living, they're not part of the middle class, upper middle class, but they're doing fine because they're working. Because for all those Americans that are not working, immigrants are working, and immigrants are taking these jobs that Americans don't want to do. And ultimately, they don't need aid, and they don't need the federal government involved or even employers offering them aid. They need a series of other things like driver's licenses so they can get to work, and maybe some sort of a pass that allows them to go back and forth to visit family, and maybe they'll stay there on occasion if that's true in their family. But this idea of aid, it's it's kind of taking our American paradigm and applying it and thinking that because when we see Americans who are hurting, we want to give them aid. So we say, well, let's do the same thing with immigrants. But immigrants are saying, do me a favor, don't treat me like an American. Don't make me dependent on the government. Don't give me aid. I got it from here. I'm working 3 jobs because Americans don't want to do those jobs. I'm good.
Okay. And speaking of just jobs in general, I know there's a lot of discourse between immigrants taking on unskilled labor jobs and kind of reducing the value of the American worker, so to speak. And how much of a role do you think immigration plays in the value of American workers?
Okay, that's a really big question. It's a good question. And it's one of those questions that splits the progressive coalition, the Democratic coalition. There are those Democrats who are pro-labor, pro-worker, and they think that immigration and immigrants hurt, workers and bring down wages and the like. I tend to be much more of the opinion that it's really the employers that set the wages and the workers who set the wages, and that ultimately these jobs are worth what people will pay for people that do them. And ultimately, I don't think it's the fault of the immigrants that the Americans have. Many Americans, I think, have lost their appetite for work. We have stories like the Great Resignation after COVID. Having nothing to do with immigrants, a bunch of people decided, I don't want to go work anymore. I need to go travel the world and find myself. Okay. And that's an American phenomenon. It's not an immigrant phenomenon. And so ultimately, I don't think it's fair to pin the lack of wages being increased and the like on workers. It's really something that is market driven. and something that that isn't being caused by immigration. It's actually something Americans are doing to themselves.
Just wanted to say that I think that the value of labor for American workers, it seems like another phenomenon that's kind of all in people's heads. Like, I've never personally heard a story where an individual got their job, quote unquote, stolen by an immigrant or someone, of a similar context. So I think it's one of those, another phenomenon, like a physical border wall that people just come up with because it scares them. And I really think that we should be grateful that there's a whole workforce coming in. I mean, immigration is a key part of like our economy and providing new jobs. It's a cycle. Americans can't work all jobs by themselves. There has to be another population contributing, and immigration is a huge part of that. And I think, in my perspective, we should be grateful that there's a workforce coming in. I guess to an extreme extent, it could be bad because you never know, those people, maybe those communities that are closer to the border might be disproportionately affected. But as someone who's in Southern California, grew up in my whole life, I've never heard a personal story of something like that, truly.
If I just could add something as well, we tend to think of this as low-skilled workers, and it's something really that impacts the lower end of the economy. And we think, I'll go to college, I'll go to graduate school, this won't be my problem, I'll opine freely about what's happening, but this is really not affecting me. But there's also a similar dynamic playing out with high-tech workers, where people with engineering degrees are going to encounter competition as people from, Brazil or from Mexico or China or India, who come into the country legally, are able, with their engineering degrees, to compete for jobs at Microsoft or somewhere else, a job you might want. And ultimately, you feel the same sort of pressures, and I take the same sort of position at that level of the economy as I do at the lower level of the economy, which is simply, life is about competition, folks. I get that we get some confusing message now and then. We have unions who demand of presidents that they impose tariffs on aluminum and steel so that we can keep out foreign competition. But by and large, that's never holds up, and that's not the way it should be. It's all about competition. It's about Burger King versus McDonald's. It's about Coca-Cola and Pepsi. And when you apply to college or graduate school, you're competing with other people to get in. And so that's going to happen at Microsoft or at McDonald's or, in low-wage jobs, picking fruit someplace. So I think that's important to keep in mind, because I think there's always a tendency to sort of say, this is a problem for the border communities. It's a problem for lower class, low-income workers. It's not my problem. But in fact, it really sort of stretches into all aspects of American life.
For sure. And kind of just to piggyback off of the idea of competition and the amount of resources and aid that we have here, for demands such as like for basic human needs, such as housing or healthcare, like that's already at an all-time high here with like our citizens. So with around like 8,000 people per day crossing into the US, how should that affect the everyday citizen? Like when there's like, how do we balance that increasing demand for services with the influx of immigration? Ruben, if you would like to start.
Super good question. Important. It's an important question. And I feel like we've gotten here to this very difficult spot where you have tons of people coming in, and even if they're not competing with you for jobs, because let's say they're taking jobs that you wouldn't want anyway, they are, as you said, putting a strain on things like, police and, well, you name it, police and fire and sanitation and other services, and hospitals and schools. And that's something ultimately we have to come to grips with. And often it's the states that have to figure that out. But let's just be clear, we didn't get here by accident. And so if you take a state like Texas, for instance, and we say, okay, the situation in Texas is that's the entry point. If you look at a map of Mexico and Latin America, that's typically the entry point into Texas. It's as you're coming, through Mexico, the first place you see is Texas. So that's where you stop first, okay? You don't go on to New Mexico or Arizona or California because it's that much further. So you're coming through Texas. And then Texas complains rightfully that there's a strain on all these things we talked about. But Texas was not sitting in the backyard, one day sipping sweet tea, minding its own business, when all of a sudden it looked off into this horizon and Texas was invaded by all these people, saying, I want to do your chores for you. I want to come in and clean your home and take care of your kids and cut your lawn and cook food in your restaurants. What happened is you've got for 30 years, you've had Texas boom, grow its economy, expand its cities on the backs of immigrant labor. And so now that everything's built and Texas has this really robust economy, I lived there for 5 years. There are cities like Dallas and Houston that are recession proofs. When everybody else is hurting, this is not Youngstown, Ohio we're talking about. Houston and Houston and Dallas and cities like that are doing fine. And so it's really dishonest for Texas now all of a sudden to complain about a situation that was not imposed on it. This is not an invasion. Okay. It's not Ukraine. It's not what Hamas did in Israel. It's not an invasion. This is people coming to show up because either they want jobs or they're coming in as refugees, fleeing a bad situation, but coming to Texas because my aunt lives in Houston. My uncle lives in Dallas. He does work. She cleans homes. They've been there for 10 years. I have a place to stay. So, what do I know? I just believe the Republicans. I took them at their word when they said during my entire lifetime that people have to take responsibility for their actions. That's the Republican mantra. They see a black kid or a brown kid in front of a judge in a courtroom and they say, people have to take responsibility for their actions. And I say, great, you sold me. I love it. I want Texas to take responsibility for its actions.
I think you make a great point. It's not like this happened all of a sudden. It's like it's been building for years and years and years. And at that point, you just have to do what you can. Like when it comes to humanitarianism and like just treat those people like they're citizens. They're in our country now. And do what you can. It would feel unethical to suggest just kick them out, like treat them like they're invading, etc. Just ignore them, focus on citizens. At that point they're there. To me, at that point they're there, you have to deal with them, like it's not like if you couldn't prevent them from coming in, which is if you want what you want as a state, you have to deal with it. I think these states that are dealing with these issues of managing like basic human needs, because we are of course always in a housing and healthcare crisis, you have to go back to the root of the problem and just try to prevent the influx at the first place. And then you can't prevent providing the aid because they're already there and they need it. That's just how I see it.
So I'm just curious, so like, what are both of you guys' thoughts on like you said, Ruben, like Texas taking responsibility? So when these states push that they're closer to the border, when they push immigrants to like more states further into the country, such as Chicago, DC, New York, and that's a further distance and things like that. Like, what do you just think about that? That continuous push, like, oh, go here. We can't do anything for you here. Like, what do you think about that?
It's a terrible stunt for and it's using these human beings, these desperate human beings as pawns, right? Women and children in many cases, not just women and children, but a lot of them women and children who come, and families who are coming here fleeing in many cases very desperate situations economically or politically, fleeing insecure environments in Central America or Venezuela. And someone like primarily Governor Greg Abbott of Texas, there was also this famous stunt that Governor Ron DeSantis embarked on, where he sent people. He didn't have. Florida isn't a border state, right? So he didn't have a ready group of undocumented immigrants to grab hold of. So he had to go to Texas and actually physically send somebody to Texas that his office paid for to go and recruit and grab hold of undocumented immigrants, like in San Antonio in a holding facility, and put them on a plane to Martha's Vineyard. And it was to prove a point and to stick, his finger in the eye of liberals, and particularly white liberals, who oftentimes talk a good game about this, but don't want these people in their neighborhood. And for years, people have said that Democrats would feel differently about this. Democrats in Massachusetts, for instance, would feel differently about this if these people were coming into their neighborhood, which kind of misses the point I made earlier. The reason they're coming into Texas and not Massachusetts is because Massachusetts has not grown its economy in the last 30 years and has not grown on the backs of illegal immigrants. And so Texas likes to go around the country and say, its governors do, and say, we have a robust economy. Come and move your companies here. Move out of Boston, move out of LA, come here to Texas. And they don't acknowledge that one of the reasons they do have that is because of this workforce. So getting back to the point, it's a desperate measure. It's a terrible, stunt. But just to kind of end with where I started before, if these people were consistent and honest, the next time Greg Abbott from Texas sends a bus to Chicago, he would send 2 buses, one full of immigrants and one full of money, dollar bills and gold bricks, and send all the money that Texas has gotten from illegal immigrants over these many years and put all the money on a bus and send both buses to Chicago. But instead, he only sends one. He's sending the immigrants, but keeping the money.
I think all I can add is when it comes to putting them on a bus, like you say, sending them off, I think that should only happen if they want to. I mean, I know these states are trying to get rid of people in a way, but that doesn't mean that other states are accepting them warmingly. And like you said, that's an issue maybe they don't. A lot of Americans think, oh, you would get it if they were there, and you might disagree and think that they shouldn't be here, etc. But if the immigrants want to go to a different state, I don't know if this is answering the question, but if they want to go, then, free movement across state borders. I mean, that's what America is supposed to be about. Then they should do that if they want to, if they can, they have the resources, but by no means should they be getting trucked off. I think, especially without consent, I would hope that doesn't happen too often.
Definitely. And Kaylee, you actually bring up my next question. But before we go on to that, do you just think that this balance of like resources and then the influx of immigrants and things like that, do you think that's feasible in the long term? Like, do you think that's even a possible thing with how our policies are going and how America as a whole is feeling about immigration? Is that even possible?
Yeah, so there's another interesting dynamic that's at work here that people don't uncover or talk about very often, and that's it's the answer to your question is that it's not likely. It's probably, let's see, the last time we did a real immigration reform package was in 1986. IRCA, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which every time you do a viable bill, as opposed to some of the bills that came after that only did enforcement, because enforcement's easy because both Republicans and Democrats support it. But a comprehensive bill that kind of mixes together, something with regard to workers and something with regard to the border security and something with regard to employers and something with regard to my God, what do you do with the people who are already here? Do you give them amnesty or not? Something comprehensive like that. We haven't done it since 1986. We're probably 50 years off from another one for one simple reason, and that is that both political parties lie to their constituents about this issue. And they've learned to do this, and that is Democrats typically campaign, look at Joe Biden, right? They campaign to say, I'm going to redo and I'm going to do away with all the Trump immigration laws. Instead, he comes in, he keeps many of them, he extends many of them, he preserves many of them. And then he says, I'm not going to build another foot of border wall, and that's out the window. So Democrats, they talk soft, and when they get in office, they act hard. And and Republicans are the opposite. They talk hard, right? I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. Oh my goodness. Tune into a Republican debate, and you see this contest to be like, I'm the tough ass. No, I'm the hard ass. You're the hard ass. Like, that's the contest. I'm going to be the toughest on illegal immigrants, as anybody on this stage. But when they get into office and they're president, we see that in order to take care of big business that relies on illegal immigrants and undocumented workforce, they go soft. So the system is corrupt because you never get to a deal because both sides are being dishonest. Neither side trusts the other side. It's kind of a big deal, as we learned from the ouster of Kevin McCarthy, the former House Speaker. It's a big deal when politicians lie to each other. They lie to us all day long, but when they lie to each other, the whole thing comes apart because nobody can trust anybody anymore. So I think that's the untold story. I think the reason that we do not have immigration reform is not because we're overly compassionate or we're not compassionate enough. It's because our politicians in Washington do not feel comfortable being honest about this issue and find it easier to lie to their own constituents. It's not lying to each other, they're lying to their own constituents and promising something they don't deliver.
Thank you so much, Ruben. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to move on to our next question, but that was really insightful. So Kaylee, you would be the first to answer this question, and you actually brought it up. You mentioned free movement within, the states and things like that. So like we kind of pride ourselves on that and being able to build connections across the country, by being able to go to Chicago, New York, Massachusetts, and wherever. So when it comes to international connections and that, and like how do you believe that our pride in our national borders, how does that differ from the pride we have in fostering our international relations? So we're like restricting that movement, because of the immigrants, we're restricting the movement internationally, but nationally we pride ourselves in that, and we magnify that, I should say.
Right. I think something Ruben mentioned earlier is just there's a matter of nationalism. A lot of people, you would think it's fine, it's your own citizens moving around your own country. And there's a part of me that thinks that as well, we're citizens of our own country. Of course, we can move around. And if someone comes in illegally, do they have that right? Do they have the same rights as we do within our own country? I think it's a totally different thing. When it comes to international collaboration, I think the best way to collaborate with Mexico and South America as a whole is to just understand each other's interests, and it is in the United States interest to reduce this influx, and if we can collaborate on that and reduce it, that would be international collaboration. I think that would satisfy the United States, and I think if there was any example of a lack of collaboration when it comes to our national borders, it would be just ignoring it and letting everything happen and ignoring the problem.
I think that's right. I think Haley's right that you can't ignore the problem, and we've done a good job of turning a blind eye to this problem for a long time. It's gotten worse and worse. Now both parties are trying to react to it, but it's really important, I think, if you want an effective solution as opposed to just a symbol or a soundbite or an issue for the next election. If you really want to get a solution, you have to go to the root, which is to do something that neither political party wants to do. Go after employers. Okay, that is the third rail of the immigration debate, going after employers, because employers, unlike undocumented immigrants who you can stick on a bus to Martha's Vineyard or a plane to Martha's Vineyard, employers fight back. Employers have money to fight you. They'll hire PR firms and law firms, and they'll sue the government and go back. And it's really a pain to go after employers and try to prove that they violate the law by knowingly hiring undocumented immigrants. And there's some pretty famous cases of big companies that the Justice Department has gone after, and the companies have won. Typically, the Justice Department does not win those cases, because employers can fight back. So the end result is neither Democrats nor Republicans want to take on employers. And it's interesting that the number one employer of undocumented immigrants in the United States is not, some big poultry firm or, some big apple farm or some construction firm. It's not even hotels and restaurants. The number one employer is the American household. The American household cannot live without undocumented immigrants, because as we all work, those of us who take seriously the idea we have to work, somebody has to cut the lawn, somebody has to clean the house, somebody has to take care of the kids, somebody has to be the elderly care provider, and so we have become dependent as a society on this workforce that we nonetheless like to complain about. So if you want to get serious, start, locking up soccer moms for 5 days at a time, every time they hire an undocumented immigrant, and then I know you're serious. But don't just go out and build a wall or talk about building a wall, a little piece of a wall, and then say you're serious. That's too easy. I want politicians to do the hard thing, and the hard thing is to pick on somebody your own size.
Can I ask, Ruben? I think I've heard something reminiscent of this in Florida, where employers the government making employers, they have to have their workers show their citizenship or something along those lines. Did you support something like that? Because I remember it was faced with a lot of controversy and upset when it came out.
Yeah. So the national version of that, if you're talking about the same thing, the national version is E-Verify. It's an electronic system that allows employers to check the status of prospective employees to see if they're in the country legally or illegally. And the debate is whether you should now employers can voluntarily participate, but the debate is whether we should make it mandatory or not. And so occasionally, whenever somebody comes up with an answer, they say we should make that mandatory. But all that does is, it gives the employer an opportunity to check the undocumented status. I'm looking for something else. I'm looking for punishment for employers, fines, jail time, whatever it is, if you break the law and knowingly hire an undocumented immigrant. And again, the Republican Party, the party of law and order, the party of the rule of law, the party that when, riots happen or people, go before a judge or all talking a tough game about how we are a country of laws. These are the same people who do not care that tons of Americans are violating the law that says you cannot knowingly hire an undocumented immigrant. So you can see in my business, I've been doing this for a long, long time, and it's easy to get cynical. I tell people it's a wonder I even vote anymore, because I have seen every slimy, lying, two-faced politician you can think of in both parties, not just Republicans and not just Democrats, but they're the same thing. The parties are the same in this regard, and it is their natural way to lie about immigration.
And just for closing thoughts, honestly, you guys both put a lot of insight into this topic and just building of what should immigration policy look like and what what immigration policy would look like. So just to close out, what do you think immigration policy will look like in the next 5 years, considering the track that we're going, or what should change to make it better? Just a general overall synopsis. Ruben, if you would like to go first.
I think we're going to see a lot more of the low-hanging fruit. I think in very difficult and uncertain times, politicians are going to want to take the easy victory. You're going to see Democrat and Republicans linking arms in favor of a border wall for whatever it's worth. The 700 miles of the 2,000 miles, they'll say they both support it. You'll see people like President Joe Biden and others signing bills passed by Congress to do what they've always done, which is to try to fortify the border. But it's not, what you won't see is what I said earlier, a smart border with an emphasis on the things that Border Patrol agents really need, because those things are not sexy. You don't go before a Rotary Club and say, I'm going to build walls. Instead of building walls, I'm going to build roads. I'm going to build roads along the U.S.-Mexico border. Border Patrol wants it so they can apprehend people. That's boring. You go and say, hey, I'm going to build a big wall. Everybody starts cheering. So we have a problem in this country, but a lot of it's wrapped up in our politicians, our elected officials, our government, our dysfunctional Congress, which is only half operating at the moment. That's kind of where we're at. It's not, I think it would help to not think of this as an external threat. We're dealing with an internal threat, and it's coming from within our political system.
For sure. Kaylee?
I agree that I think the topic of conversation, is not going to leave the American people's minds, and politicians are going to keep rallying to the point of, protecting and the security of the border and everything, and the security of the United States. And I think the United States is in a very dissatisfied state. I mean, at least for the last 5-6 years, people have been really upset with just how politics are going as a whole. And I think politicians will really try to appeal to what they think the American people will like, which is more security. But as we talked about earlier, there hasn't been serious reform in years and years and years. So I don't know if much will change, but there will definitely be heightened conversations, as there has been, about what we can do. And because we are so dissatisfied with the last presidency, flip-flop to blue, I do see the possibility of flip-flopping back to red, because of all the distaste we have for the government these days, and they could potentially crack down on it in a way that we haven't seen. But much change, I'm not 100% sure if that'll happen, but it'll definitely be in the conversation, and politicians will be appealing to that.
For sure. And with the presidential election, I guess we'll see where the future of immigration goes. So thank you both so much for being here with me today, and with our national conversation for our podcast episode. If you would like to plug your social media handles or any other promo that you feel is necessary here?
So I'll just jump in quickly. In addition to visiting my website, rubennavarrette.com, I'm excited to have launched recently a new Substack newsletter where I talk about immigration and other issues. You can find that at Navarrette Nation Substack.
You can find my articles and op-eds on our national conversation. You should definitely go check out the website.
Awesome. And speaking of the website, you can follow us at ournationalconversation.org or Our National Conversation on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok, or our NATL Convo on X, formerly known as Twitter. This has been this week's episode of Allow Us to Explain, where we talk about immigration. Tune in for next week's episode, and we'll see you guys next week.
This podcast was brought to you by Our National Conversation, a place where students generate policy solutions to the biggest problems facing America. Join us in freeing political dialogue from hyperpartisanship. To learn more about what you heard today, check us out at ournationalconversation.org. You can also follow us on social media at Our National Conversation to show your support and keep up with our latest efforts.